And this morning we'll try and establish precisely where the Labor movement is on Julia Gillard's leadership. We'll be joined in the studio by ACTU President Jed Carney. But first we'll see how the Sunday papers are reporting the by-election. Dennis Atkins, broadly in line, I guess, with our interpretation this morning?
Yes, it's broadly as Francis outlined it there. Josh Gordon in The Age has got the first piece of considered analysis. He says that the result's not a ringing endorsement for anyone, and he says that if Labor does win, he says that looks likely it won't be an emphatic victory. He also goes on to say that his assessment is it'll be broadly neutral for Julia Gillard. I think that's probably right, although I think that essentially there will be a sense of great relief. In fact, I spoke to some people in the government this morning and they were relieved at the fact that they won and the fact that they looked like winning, not very comfortably, but with enough of a margin there. The vote in the end, the Labor vote in the state seat of Melbourne, didn't drop all that much on the primary vote. It only fell down from about 35 to 33%. So that's not much of a vote. The Green vote didn't go up. It went up on the state figures by about 5%. But if you go back and look at the 2010 federal election, and for the federal seat of Melbourne, this vote for the Greens was pretty well the same as what Adam Bandt got in 2010. And we're talking here about sort of the heartland of that Green vote. North Melbourne, Kensington, those sort of suburbs where there is a really big Green presence. Now, those votes in those booths held up. Elsewhere, it fell off a bit, even though the Labor vote was suppressed. I think Adam Bandt will struggle to win the seat from 36% of the primary vote if both of the major parties are going to preference against him.
I think that's right. I think he's got a real fight on his hands. And Lenore, the other, I think, take out on this is you would think it will encourage those who want to build a bit of distance now between the Labor Party and the Greens.
Well, to some extent, although I do think that one needs to think about how Labor goes about the product differentiation. Clearly, they need to differentiate themselves from the Greens, but I do think that the reason this by-election became one that was seen to have federal significance when in fact it's a state by-election in the one single part of the country that voted a Green in during the last federal election. The reason it was seen to have federal significance was because the Labor Party chose the duration of this campaign to engage in product differentiation in a very sort of verbal war of words kind of way. I reckon most voters prefer product differentiation when it's done in a civilised way, explaining why your policies are better than the other guys, and particularly voters in a seat where they are inclined to vote Green would surely prefer product differentiation done in that way. So I think, yes, it means, I think the Labor Party has a lot of thinking to do about how they differentiate themselves, but the means of that differentiation, I think, needs to be thought through a lot too.
And the way that the Victorian branch has differentiated itself from the Greens
is much in a much quieter, more civilised manner.
And they were very angry about the intervention by the New South Wales right, particularly Paul Howes and Sam Dastyari. So I think they'll be saying, look, we proved our point.
Yeah.
I think it is striking when you just step back at it that the first 10 minutes or so of this program is given over to a state by-election, on which the Liberal Party doesn't even contest. So the likely new next party is going to be in power in Canberra, is not even taking part on this. And of course it does. It's all because of the weakness of the Federal Labor Party vote, the weakness of the Prime Minister's position, and whether this would seem to be a bit of a poll result on her Prime Ministership, and the question of the split in the Labor forces between the left progressives and the more traditional Labor. Probably leaves that a little bit unresolved. It probably leaves a little bit open as to whether the best strategy for Labor is to bash the Greens over the head, or to take the more Victorian, more progressive sort of position there. Leaves things a bit open, but probably doesn't fully answer the question as have the Greens peaked as a left force in Australian politics. Yeah. Probably it's obviously not the breakthrough they wanted, but probably still leaves that open.
I take your point on that too, and without the, of course, with the Liberals not contesting, I think that Ted Baillieu, the Premier, would have taken the view, I'll sit back and just enjoy this fight between the two. But I think what happened was Daniel Andrews built a profile out of this campaign and actually campaigned quite well. So I'm not sure in the end that it was...
It probably gives him,
quite the way he would have expected.
Probably gives him his first win, and he's not a natural. When you look at him, you don't think, wow, there's a really strong politician, but it probably gives him his first win. I think for Baillieu, there's nothing in it for the Libs to really contest this because they're never going to win the seat.
No, you wouldn't want to spend money on it.
So, why spend money on it? Just let Labor and the Greens bash it out a bit, so it probably ends up.
But Daniel Andrews' point, we can deliver. We have the possibility of delivering policies the Greens don't, is a much more cogent point than just they're extremists and they're horrible, particularly in a seat inclined to vote for them in the first place.
And it did, for the first time, probably start to put pressure on actual Green policies. Like, when have you seen serious debate about Greens costings? Because they're now
and
starting
that all
to
unravelled this week.
That unravelled this week. So that was probably a little bit of a watershed in Australian politics on that point.
There's one other point to make. It's not a big point, and you wouldn't want to make too much of it because of the particular circumstances of this by-election, but I think some in Labor will be taking a little bit of comfort from the fact that you can win a seat from a primary vote of 33 to 35% of the vote.
Yeah,
in very unusual circumstances.
But that is relying on sex party votes, and this, of course, is distinguished this poll for probably a record vote, surely, for the sex party in Australia.
No. They've done around 7% before, and it does raise this question that they're well placed to get a Senate seat. The next time around, given the way the preferences are going.
And anybody's going to take the sex party votes. Brett Mason in Queensland won the last LMP Senate seat on sex party preferences, so I don't think anybody particularly cares where they come from.
And they got twice the vote of Family First too, which was interesting. Just before we move on, Lenore, a story about Kevin Rudd's position on gay marriage.
Yeah, so this is an interesting little story in the Sunday Age that gay marriage advocates, including the former Australian Medical Association head Karen Phelps and her partner Jackie Stricker, and the Jeff Thomas, who's the father who gets up on Q&A and asks questions about gay marriage a lot, all say they talked about gay marriage with Mr Rudd at the last ALP conference in Sydney, and he said that if he was Prime Minister it would have gone through and that he would fix it. Now, Mr Rudd says he's not going to talk about private conversations, and he points out what his policy was, before he lost the Prime Ministership. But it's just another interesting report in the kind of drip of reports about what Mr Rudd is or isn't doing. And it does tally with reports at the time that Mr Rudd went along to the Rainbow Labor drinks after that conference, where there was a big debate about gay marriage. I think it's quite an interesting little addition to the debate.
And also in that report, there's a claim that Kevin Rudd told those people at the drinks that Julia Gillard in Cabinet had supported same-sex marriage, which Kevin Rudd's spokesman denies. But that's another little bit on the table.
All right, well, that's the Sunday Papers. Now to our studio guest, the President of the ACTU, Jed Carney. Now, when it was suggested this week that some unions might be going soft on Julia Gillard's leadership, Transport Workers Union boss Tony Sheldon threatened to withdraw donations to the Labor Party if they change leaders. Here's Tony Sheldon and Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey.